What's happening, people, and welcome to this week's episode of It's All Blakademik with your host, myself, Jordan Jarrett-Bryan. Now, before I announce our panel and our debate for this week, I want to do another shout out to our socials. As usual, you know by now, I know all you guys out there, if you're watching this, you're on social media, so don't front. Follow us on Instagram, follow us on Facebook, and please follow us on Twitter as well. And if you're here, you might as well subscribe to us as well. The button is just below us right now, so click it, and you'll get now weekly content from the Blakademik TV crew. Right, so this week on the show, I want to have a discussion with my panel here about being black and being a member of the Tory party and a Tory supporter. And to do so, I've got here Ola Kalade, who's a community engagement from the Tory party. Yep. I've also got here Fumi Olatoye, who's works as a consultant across parties and also a bit of PR as well. Mm-hmm. And I've got here Dane Baptiste here, who I know is personally very politically engaged. Is that fair to say?
It's fair to say.
Fair to say.
Yeah. I'd say my, political leaning is kind of apolitical, but yeah, a few, the sensibilities from each side.
Cool, and I want to come to that as well because that's something I want to bring out as well in the debate. But I'll start with you, Ola. Tell me a little bit about how long you've been a supporter and a member within the Tory party, and why you feel the Tory party is the party that can do good for the black community.
Good for the black community, yeah. So I guess my day job on a day-to-day basis is running a program called National Citizen Service, and that's completely government funded. So since 2011, it was actually part of the big society idea that David Cameron had. And ever since then, I've been quite involved with sort of national government and just kind of observing what policy works and how that funding can help social integration. So the whole premise of the program itself is about getting people from different community backgrounds, mixing with each other, getting to understand each other, getting to celebrate each other, and actually building something. So through, volunteering with local charities, campaigning for local issues, and fundraising for local issues as well. So through that, I've worked with different MPs, and I just started to pay attention to, the national landscape from a political standpoint. So I was actually born and raised in Nigeria, so British politics wasn't something that naturally came to me. But I'll probably say around sort of 2008 was when I sort of started paying attention and getting more involved. And I made a decision about 18 months ago to actually join the Conservative Party. And since then, it's just been, it's just been exciting, really exciting, just loads of opportunities to grow in that.
What are the values of the Conservative Party do you feel conducive to supporting them as a black man?
As a black man, so like I said, I was born and raised in Nigeria. My dad was a businessman before he got involved, quite involved with the church. And it was just the values of ambition, the power of personal responsibility. And, in Nigeria, you don't have a local government. You don't have someone who's providing you water. You create your own water. You don't have someone providing you electricity. You create your own electricity. So I think it's just that whole premise of having a small government, but actually empowering people to be their own champions of their own destiny. So I think when I looked around the political landscape, looked at Labour, Lib Dems, Greens, I guess the party I think it's impossible to have a party that totally represents you, whether it's as a black man or as a man or as anyone. But in terms of values, in terms of aspirations, I think the party that spoke to me the most was the Conservative Party. And then we can talk about sort of individuals and how specific individuals sort of reached out. Because it is all about individuals in terms of relationships. Sure. So I think that's my journey, just my personal beliefs and my values, and then just the power of the individual. So, I was talking to Fumi about a friend of mine called Samuel Kasumu, who I went to university with, and he's been quite involved with the Conservative Party. And in 2017, he ran for as an MP in Croydon. And when I saw that, representation is important, because when I saw that, I was like, actually, regardless of what party, if he can do that, surely I can do that as well. And talking about NCS as well, so we reached out to a lot of politicians at the time, and I know it's a Conservative policy, so you would have a vested interest for Conservative MPs to get involved. But at the same time, we reached out to MPs in Croydon, because I was working in Croydon at the time. We reached out to MPs across the political spectrum, but it only seemed that it was the Conservative MPs who were bothered. And this wasn't something about making money, it was about something about, talking to young people, getting young people involved in their local communities. So I think for me, a guy called Gavin Barwell, who's Theresa May's chief of staff now, he actually came on the programme. He was an MP in Croydon Central at the time, and he came to speak to young people. And these were predominantly sort of young black boys in Croydon. And he just spoke about the importance of community engagement, the importance of, understanding your community and giving back to your community. And from there, I didn't really have a political home at the time, but just seeing that, you have the stereotype of conservative MPs or conservatives just being sort of white, old, rich.
Well, let me pause you there because I want to come back to that kind of perception.
Yeah.
Dane, as you said at the top there, you're quite politically engaged without necessarily being affiliated strongly to any one party.
Yeah.
Why, if indeed is the case, are the Tory party not a party that, as a black person, you feel isn't for you? And if that's true, is it a race thing for you? Is it they're not conducive to the black community and what the black community needs and wants?
I think the most prominent example for me would be the Windrush scandal, and particularly their handling of that. And going back to what Ola said, I think it's very valid to say that there are a lot of views from people that may be first, second generation immigrants, particularly from maybe West Africa or the British West Indies, who are kind of quasi-conservative in their views, which are kind of just a kind of intersectionality between the self-determination and also kind of fundamental Christianity. And with that, by that merit, a lot of Caribbeans that came over would have kind of made a life for themselves, actively contributed towards their community, and in return for their work, they got a slap in the face. So far as they were Caribbeans, immigrants, and to a very slightly less extent later on, African immigrants would have contributed towards building a infrastructure in London, particularly, as well as working towards providing universal healthcare in this country. And then for them to be told that they have to return to their countries where even though they've been in the UK longer than they've been in their respective countries of origin, I just find to be ridiculous. And I don't think any party that would be, working towards some galvanizing the community would ever allow something like that to happen, especially when, as we investigate further, we find out that records have been destroyed, kind of thing, which would have, even if people wanted to follow protocol and actually try and apply for citizenship in the UK, which they were actually told after a certain amount of time would have been axiomatic for them to have had after working and paying taxes for so long, then loopholes are being found which are allowing for people to be kind of deported. And so I don't think, and this also just, there's repeated issues and sound bites from members of the Conservative Party, which have come across as being very, very racist, as well as the fact that you find further former Conservative Party members then going on to work for UKIP and allowing this very racist or racially charged narrative to continue. So for me, myself personally, I just remain very skeptical that it can be a party that would serve the interests of the diaspora.
Needs.
Yeah.
Do you, if I can just go back, do you have a specific example of a Conservative member going to work for UKIP?
There's probably a few of them, but
Specific examples?
No, there's a specific one. So you think there's no one from the Conservative Party who's left the Tories and gone and joined UKIP?
Not to my knowledge, no.
No,
Are you talking about
there's two.
voters or are you talking about workers?
You're talking about MPs, right?
I'm talking about MPs,
There's two MPs that have done that.
Are you talking about voters or MPs though?
I'm talking about MPs.
Okay.
Yeah. Voters, I mean, the voters, that's fine, because you've got members, the Labour Party that end up voting for UKIP, but I'm talking about specifically
MPs.
two MPs to the point where it appears that UKIP exists as a shell party for super racist Conservative members.
MPs, just to clarify that, MPs don't work for the party. MPs are public servants. So I think there's a difference between understanding what the Conservative machine is, the party. Party is very different to MPs who obviously work for.
Yeah, but the acronym would suggest that they are members of the party, so that they do agree with the ideology of the party.
Yeah.
And so far as and again, that would make me even more cynical. Obviously, the reference of them being public servants is that when you have an expenses scandal and these instances of misappropriation of taxpayers' money for the purposes of people wanting to build moats in their houses, it makes me very cynical that they are acting in the interests of community. So I feel like at a certain level, when you are able to transcend maybe your class and realize something, like a lot of people are able to do, like for the Windrush generation, then class becomes more of a factor than race does. And I feel for a lot of people that may have, from our community, that may have a lot more in common with other Conservatives, it's more of a class issue as opposed to a race one. And I feel that if you are going to be a member of a party whereby, there is a mismanagement of funds, and as a civil servant, you're not acting in the interest of a community, then, considering how much of the diaspora forms the working class in this country, I just don't really see how they could really be benefiting us.
But let me just bring in for me now. as someone that works across all the parties, do you feel that the Conservative parties have the worst values, or even maybe just the worst public image of trying to attract the black votes? And is it some of the examples that Dana's given that are just so bad, they're never going to attract a certain proportion of the black community to vote for them?
You know, I think what it is, it's historical. I think the problem is that we have people who are in their, 50s, 60s, 70s who still remember the imagery and the message of the Conservative Party, after the war, where they said, if you want a Negro as a neighbour, vote Labour. So I think people still have that in the back of their minds. And as a result, these kind of things are passed on to generation to generation to generation. So even though not necessarily people who are my age, so, so-called millennials, we might not necessarily see that kind of negative imagery from the Conservative Party. We very much still have that from our parents, our grandparents. And it's word of mouth. Word of mouth is the most powerful tool, I guess, to bring across a message. I think because of the fact that the Conservative Party do have that historic, negative imagery where they're trying to portray themselves as someone who was at the time for white people and, non-immigrants. I think that's something that they're still suffering from for today.
And did you notice any kind of shift in, I suppose, or rise in numbers of black people, maybe of generation of our grandparents that maybe were considering voting Tory, and then the Windrush scandal just ended that? Anyone that was potentially who's black thinking about maybe the Tories have changed, that ended that.
I think honestly it depends on the demographic that you speak to, because if you speak to some Caribbeans, absolutely there's complete uproar in that community, and rightly so, that they're upset that the government did not do what they could have done and as efficiently as they could have done, considering how serious the scandal was. But then if you speak to some Africans, it's a bit like, well, that was unfortunate, but thank God it didn't happen to me. And they continue to vote for whatever party they feel fits their beliefs. So I think it definitely does. And
is that dangerous? Because the fact that it didn't happen to them, it could have happened to them. Is that mindset of it, what didn't happen to me and my direct community, so I can let it slide. Is that quite dangerous?
I mean, it depends. I always say it depends, but it really does depend, because the thing is that as black people, we are minority in this country. So you'd think that, no matter what part of that kind of black demographic you fall part of, whether it's Caribbean or African, we should so-called stick together. But I still feel like there is a bit of a divide where Africans do feel like, oh, that's a shame that happened to Caribbeans, and Caribbeans might feel the same way if it was vice versa. And to say if it's dangerous, I don't know if dangerous is the right word, but I think it's unfortunate that we don't kind of see ourselves as a collective, because at the end of the day, we still are facing the same issues. We still have a so-called common enemy, if you like, which is racism and those who hold those racist views. So I still feel that, as much as some Africans or some Caribbeans may differ in their opinion when it comes to the Windrush scandal, to say it's dangerous, I wouldn't go that far, but I think it's unfortunate that we don't have the same collective view.
Ola, as someone that's affiliated with the Conservative Party, when you tell other black people that you work for the Tory party, what's the reaction generally?
I don't work for the Conservative
Sorry, you don't work for the
Sorry.
But you're affiliated.
I think
you're part of the party.
Yeah, I remember. I think it depends. I think the older generation, I totally agree with everything that you said, might have sort of reservations about it. For example, my dad always voted Conservative, and he was I'm an immigrant. I was born and raised in Nigeria. And so was my dad. So I think it just depends on individual experiences as well. But I think leadership is so important. I think leadership is important in reference to, these sort of campaigns. Because I guess when you look at when the campaigns put out, because I've been involved with national and local campaigns, what campaigns are trying to do are trying to resonate a message to the country. So actually, if a country has those sort of views, what someone who might not necessarily run a good campaign might do is to tender to those specific views. So I think it's a little bit unfair to paint. I mean, a huge mistake to have such a campaign of that message. But I think we should think about leadership, because if someone who was the right leader saw that campaign, they should have actually said, no, that's not fine. That's not okay. We're not going to run that campaign.
But not necessarily, because you have to remember that at that time, that was how people thought. That was the culture
or not
of the day. Yeah, that was the culture of the day.
Yeah.
So it's difficult to say that a leader should have looked at that campaign and said, "Oh, that's bad," because that was just the culture of the day. The same way now, we accept people of the LGBT community 10, 15, 20 years ago, people wouldn't have done. So it's easy for someone now to say, well, back then, why did you not accept them? But it's because you're looking in hindsight.
Yeah, I say that to say this. So David Cameron was someone who, like I said, kind of got me involved in the party just looking at him. And he was someone who made a massive step to reach out to different ethnic communities. And the black vote actually went up when David Cameron was in power. So my point about leadership is, if you have someone, whether you're leading a party, you're leading a church, or you're leading an organization, who has a vested interest to make sure representation is important, to make sure that, you know, whether it's the country who has these views or different communities, actually, how can we reach out and give people different voices, and how can we actually fight racism? So I think it's just important to have that perspective as well. Because if you have, for example, you know, Jeremy Corbyn, now that he's a leader, 10 years ago, there weren't any messages about, you know, the Labour Party being anti-Semitic. The reason why these conversations are coming up is because certain people see something about his character that might suggest so that's why I think leadership is important. Because, you know, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister, these conversations weren't coming up. So, you know, 50 years ago, if you had someone like Enoch Powell, for example, who was, you know, some people would say he was racist, and he was a minister.
I think everyone would say
that's a commonly shared view.
Racists always reference him. So so far as leadership, like, while David Cameron may have encouraged this big society, I mean, it's not really a function of leadership. It's a function of how good your publicist is. So if you have a good media cycle or good media campaign which can portray you as being a lot more cosmopolitan or inclusive, then it's a lot easier for that to be portrayed. Whereas obviously someone from Jeremy Corbyn who has a lot more leftist socialist leanings is not going to invest the same amount of money and time in terms of revamping his image. And while it's been seen now that there's been all these references of him being anti-Semitic, it's not really been an issue of, no one has any sound bites of him saying something that is anti-Semitic. And also it's really more anti-Zionist. It's just been used that because it's people within his party that have maybe had expressed views, like maybe Ken Livingstone, for example, which have been perceived as anti-Semitic, and because he's refused to condemn them, then he's now been given this title of being an apologist for anti-Semites. Now, going back to the issue of, again, if we go back to the issue of leadership, well, David Cameron would be a perfect example because, you know, so far as leadership, to suggest a referendum and then to abandon your post, so which brings us where we are now, doesn't really seem to me to be any form of leadership with any kind of efficacy, especially because if you speak to most people regarding Brexit and votes on Brexit, whether it's Remain, but mainly for those who wanted to leave, for most people, their impetus for them voting to leave would have been for tighter immigration. So again, while this idea was being purported by the Conservative Party about inclusion and about a big society, then you now have the head of the Conservative Party and the Prime Minister overseeing us leaving Europe. And a large part of the people that support us leaving Europe did so under the pretense that we'd be able to have more regulation on immigration. I just think for a party that emphasizes like free economy and you know, self-determination and efficiency, what economy are you going to have that's not going to grow without immigration?
But it's just more, just to come back, it's more than an image, because it's about £200 million a year that's going into social integration, you know, bringing communities together. So it's fair for you to say it's about image, but money sort of being backed up to contribute to that.
I feel like that money probably would be easier obtained if there were more regulation in terms of practices of medium to larger enterprises or multinationals that operate in the UK and are able to enjoy tax evasion, or for example, more scrutiny in the same way that you're scrutinized for like blue collar criminals. Same scrutiny was given to the misappropriation of expenses by MPs, then you'd have a much
significant
larger
amount
base.
of those MPs were Labour MPs as well. But we won't call all Labour MPs or Labour members or activists fraudsters, would we? We wouldn't call a party full of fraudsters if, you know, 10% of its MPs were found guilty for you know, using or misusing.
But we're calling them a party of anti-Semites.
I personally, I'm not doing that.
You know, but I mean, but that's what Jeremy Corbyn's been called, is housing and protecting anti-Semites. But, you know, it's not, so far as like other MPs, like I said, I don't really have any leadings like where I'm completely affiliated with the Labour Party. But so far as like, you know, centrist or right-wing politicians who would talk about like, you know, a narrative whereby they are more opposed to the idea of, you know, social care, not so much social inclusion, but actual social care, and, you know, and are more in favour of like privatisation, to speak on one side and talk about privatisation of healthcare services, but then at the same time be involved in profiting directly from a tax base, is a lot more of a conflicting ideology as opposed to people in Labour who support the idea of socialism and are civil servants.
That's a good point. Good point.
Let me ask you for me. So a lot of the policies that have been implemented over the years through the Tory party have been policies that have been not gone down well with the black community generally. Not all, but large parts of the black community. But you work in PR, is the PR on top of that another reason why a lot of young black people just would never go anywhere near the Tory party?
Again, I think it just goes back to the word of mouth situation. It's what you hear from your friends, it's what you hear from your neighbours, it's what you hear from your family.
Are they doing a good job in reaching out to the black community?
I think they're doing a much better job than they were, say, during John Major's time, certainly during Thatcher's time. I think, going back to what Ola said about David Cameron and the fact that he did this kind of big society campaign, it has gone some way to try and get more young people into the Conservative Party. I mean, look, we're seeing an example of that. So I think the Tory Party is heading in a direction where they do realise that, modern times are changing and it is about inclusiveness and diversity. Whether you want to be sceptical and say, well, you're just trying to get the votes is one thing, but another thing could be maybe David Cameron truly feels that, inclusion and diversity is important. But I think they are doing a much better job now than they were 10, 15, 20 years ago.
What have they got to do now to further improve on that image and that work that you say they've done to try and reach out to the black voters?
I think the main thing is the recruiting process, very much so. I think if you see yourself in a situation or if you see someone like you in a particular job or role, it galvanizes you to think, well, actually, I can do the same thing. Ola said to me that he saw a mutual friend of ours, Samuel Kasumi, running Croydon North as a Conservative MP, albeit it was a safe seat. He's still a black person running as a potential MP, which, if you're someone who has conservative views and you see that kind of person, that's amazing. You see yourself and think, well, actually, if he can do it, I can do it. So I think if the Conservative Party were able to recruit more people of colour, of different sexualities, of different, backgrounds, those people will in turn be a mirror to potential people who could come to the Conservative Party who aren't just your kind of bog standard white middle class male.
Just super briefly, Ola, you mentioned earlier on about you came in from Nigeria. How do you feel about the immigration policy of the Tory party, considering that you'll have friends like yourself that came here from parts of Africa? Are you comfortable with their take on immigration and their attitude towards immigration?
So as in the party or the government? Because
the party.
I guess the government implement policies. I guess the party is just a machine. The party doesn't necessarily have policies.
The government then.
But it has,
See, and this is what bothers me about politics in general, is that this kind of straw man kind of mentality whereby we talk about the machine and we talk about the institution, but the institution is powered by and driven by human resource in terms of the form of people. So I understand that it's not the machine or the government, but at a very rudimentary level, these policies come from discourse that happens within Parliament. This is how policy is formed. So when we kind of I think it's kind of like shirking responsibility to be like, well, that's the machine. That's the machine. The machine is driven by the human resources, by people themselves. So for me, it's like I understand we can say like this is the machine, but these policies come from and that they are formed as a concept from other people. So
are you comfortable with the policy, considering
I guess
an immigrant yourself?
I mean, I'm not going to speak as an expert on immigration policy because I'll be lying to you. But if I look at my journey, and when myself and my brothers came here, we had to pay a significant amount of money to become British citizens. And my viewpoint is that there should be a fair system. So just because you live in France or Spain doesn't mean you should have the free access to just come here and not sort of pay your way to become a citizen or become a resident. So I think I came legally, and there's a different conversation about people who are maybe fleeing areas of war. But if you come here legally, then there's a conversation about whether it's an amnesty or how you become a citizen, if that makes sense. So I guess my viewpoint is I preach for a fairer society, and at the same time, as a Christian, I think honesty is key. So if you find your way into this country through illegal means, and whilst I have members of my church who came through those means and eventually became citizens, I think it's just a significant journey, and I haven't experienced that myself, so I don't necessarily know what it feels like. But having come through my journey, I think it would be fair to say, coming through that process and being someone who's I feel like I've contributed to this country. I didn't have to stay in this country. I could go back to Nigeria because I came here for education.
Okay.
So I think it's just, if you're going to come here legally, and if you can't, then, you know, make sure you do whatever it takes for you to be a legal citizen of a country or resident of the country.
Okay, I've just got a couple of minutes left, guys. Let me just ask you, do you feel generally politics is failing the black community across parties? Or do you think it's a party by party basis?
I think politics is failing the people generally. But obviously, because black people find themselves in, you know, a so-called lower socioeconomic demographic, you know, we get the hardest hit.
I think it's important, sorry to interrupt you as well, for me, is that, again, when it comes to political discourse, we have to remember that the vote wasn't even a privilege we were able to enjoy up until a few recent generations. So sometimes I think there's this pressure for black people to have a high political aptitude than they should have, because, you know, the knowledge of politics and the mechanics of which, outside of a bipartisan paradigm, is only maybe 3 generations deep for us in this country. Like, you think about even the States as well, Civil Rights Act was signed, 70s? So that's like recorded memory when my parents were alive. So even they would remember the time when they were alive, where like my parents were like teenagers before Martin Luther King was assassinated. So yeah, I think it's failing, but it's not failing because of like the fact that we're refusing to engage. Like, this is something we're having to get to grips with, you know, very slowly.
But at the same time, I feel like even though as you said, we're 3 generations deep, I still don't feel like it's an excuse for black people not to get involved. Because if you do speak to let me not say the average black person, but if you do speak to many black people, they just feel kind of like, oh, whatever, you know, they're going to do what they're going to do anyway. I don't vote. I don't care. That kind of apathy is exactly why policies are not made in our favour, because they just think, well, you're not going to vote, regardless of the fact that you're Labour, Conservative, Green Party, Lib Dem, whatever. So it's very, very important to, you know, to have an active voice in the community, because the reason why newspapers write the way they write for a certain demographic is because they know those people pick up the papers. They feed that audience. So, and that's normally Middle England. So say, for example, if black people had a stronger voice, we would be able to sway politicians to write policies that would benefit us, because they know, right, you know, the black community have a strong voice. The same way Jewish people have a very strong voice in the US. There are policies that certain politicians and certain parties there know that, you know what, if they create this policy, they know a certain demographic will vote for them. And I think that if black people were more engaged, we would be able to have those policies and ultimately those laws work in our favour.
Absolutely.
Just in 30 seconds, just apolitical was the phrase used at the top there.
Yeah.
Just tell us why.
Well,
and it might follow on from that.
Yeah, basically, as I said, yeah, basically that, like, you know, again, going back to like what's a bipartisan political structure or a 2-party system, is that both of them may have been at some point maybe worked to galvanise and curry favour from the diaspora, but no one really acts in our interest, and maybe because we're not that politically engaged. So I say I'm apolitical because most of the movements that I've seen that have been working towards self-determination for Caribbeans and African people have come from people that existed outside of the political paradigm. So for me, I say apolitical because I'm not going to be naive enough to think that all of Labour's policies, for example, serve my interest, and the same for Conservative either. So really, my real, I guess, outlook would be is that for the diaspora and for Black British, whether we're immigrants or people or indigenous to the country or born here, then the endeavour should be to maybe have that community galvanise and assert what policies would benefit them before we begin to align ourselves with any of the political parties.
Guys, that was great. Thanks for your time. Thank you very much. Do not forget to subscribe to us on all of our socials, Insta, Facebook and Twitter. We're also on here, YouTube. Subscribe to our channel as well. Tell a friend, tell the cabman, tell your mum, tell your dad, tell everybody. Blakademik TV. Until next week, peace.